Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are going to pretend this is the last show in our Battle of the Bulge series, although technically Jonathan Ware is coming on Saturday to do his show about the Tommies in the Ardennes, but he had to delay that because of personal reasons. But we're going to pretend this is the last show tonight. And Peter Caddick-Adams kicked us off with our 10 things we should know about the Battle of the Bulge. And today we're going to kind of wrap things up with a more of a sort of freestyle chat just about how the battle concluded, draw some conclusions about what won it for the Allies, what blew it for the Germans, and particularly what happened next. Because as we often talk about on World War II TV, we mark World War II by those kind of landmark moments, D-Day and Market Garden, Battle of the Bulge. And for a lot of average assessment of World War II, it seems that after the Battle of the Bulge, nothing happened. Then VE Day comes in May, and of course lots happened in between those, and that's what Peter's going to talk to us about. So without further ado, and we seem to have cured the internet problems of last time, although Peter's on standby to rejoin with his mobile phone if things go awry, but I don't think they are. So without further ado, here is Mr. Peter Caddick-Adams. How are you today, sir?
Very well indeed, Woody, and Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you and to everyone who's tuned in to listen to us. So no snow here, but we'll try and get into the Bulge mood.
Yeah, indeed. So, the one conclusion I have taken away from the shows I've been doing, we've looked at cavalry groups. Steve Zaloga took us through the Panzer actions on the northern shoulder. John Bernstein talked about the 9th Air Force, is that putting the success down to one thing is kind of be a mistake. It was lots of things coming together. Of course, Bastogne was important. Of course, the defeat of the armor Saint-Vith, Piper's column, of course, the air power. And lots of things went wrong from the German point of view as well to bring it to an end. But you've written this incredible, we talked about last time, magnum opus on the Battle of the Bulge. When you were bringing that book to an end, what were your main points about how it resolved itself and what conclusions we can take from the end of the battle?
Well, I had a look at the battle as a whole. You never really know how you're going to finish a book. And I looked at it and suddenly realized that this was the supreme test of the United States Army in Europe in World War II. It had been tested in a way that no other circumstance could put it under the microscope. So the Normandy landings, it had rehearsed for ad nauseum, and the same with the Normandy battles. But the true test of an army is not if you rehearse for something forever and ever and get it right. The true test of an army is obviously when things go wrong.
Yeah.
The proof of the pudding here is American training was good, was right, and American equipment was exactly what was needed. And the training is really important because the Bulge was very much a story of a lot of Americans being cut off. Small groups, right up to battalion size organizations and larger, but cut off from their commanders and really left to their own devices. And therefore, this is where training kicked in. And of course, the other way we can look at the Bulge is that it was contested, much of that forest and the woodland areas and the high ground and so on. It was contested in May 1940 by the French and the Belgians when the Germans roll through invading France. And that's one of the reasons why Hitler chose it again. So why in 1940 did the French and Belgians fold very quickly? And why did the Americans hold out in 1944? And that's really important to know, but it gives you a yardstick straight away. And the answer is that American training was, if you have your orders, you stick to them. If you have a crossroads to defend, you stay there and defend it. You don't move on thinking that cup of coffee in the NAFI or the PX down the road is really where you need to be, or you do, and you don't drift off with your friends. If you have orders to be somewhere, you get yourself there, and if you have orders to stay and fight to the last cartridge, that's really what you need to do. And that requires a lot of bravery, but it does mean that junior leaders need to have a sense of what it is they should be doing at all times. And therefore, if you lose that upper tier of the chain of command, it doesn't matter because you know what to do. And so just as the Germans then and Allied armies today, NATO armies, are taught to understand the level of command, the intent 2 and 3 up, so too the Americans had sort of inculcated that. So the training was proved to be right. And if you look back, there's no better test. And the US Army hadn't been found wanting. Yeah, they were caught by surprise.
Mm.
And that surprise was the German secret weapon. But that would only last for 24, 48 hours. And after that, it's how quickly the Americans get their act together. And I think, that's a great starting block.
And would it be fair to say that, in a sense, despite the terrible conditions and the weather that came in, it was a good time for the US Army to be tested, because they had, in terms of production, they've got things trundling along quite well now. They've got things coming in. They've learned some lessons in Normandy. They've learned some lessons in Italy. They've learned in North Africa and Tunisia. So in many ways, they're kind of just about reaching their peak in terms of their efficiency, experience, that blend of everything you need to have a functioning army. You need experience, you need replacements, you need a training doctrine that works. So was it just, with hindsight, was it kind of a good time for them to be put to the test?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid observation. And of course, we get carried away by the teeth arms, the performance of the artillery, perhaps on the Elsenborn Ridge. We've talked about cavalry groups and tank battalions and so on, the armored divisions, and the infantry everywhere. But the Bulge is really a triumph of American logistics. Once you've identified the problem area, how soon can you truck the rest of the US Army there? How can you ensure that everyone has all the supplies, the ammunition, particularly medical supplies in those kind of conditions? And the Americans had already had that test. In fact, the Allies had, with the Red Ball Express. So we'd had shortages, desperate shortages, in September, October 1944, when the Allied advance literally ground to a halt. We ran out of fuel. Patton ran out of fuel. We just didn't have any kind of trucks or anything, and didn't have enough trucks. And so the Red Ball Express eventually evolved, taking trucks from all over the place and from ports to rebalance Allied logistics. And with that in mind, the Germans probably struck, at the right time for them in terms of weather, closing down Allied air, but we'd already won that logistical battle. So all we had to do is switch on the Red Ball Express again. The ad hoc way that we just impounded trucks left, right, and center, even semi-trailers, articulated trailers, put masses of troops in them, standing up. Health and safety went out of the window. But if it was a case of trucking huge numbers of troops from A to B as quickly as possible overnight in freezing conditions, but getting them there, then the Red Ball Express had shown the US Army exactly how to do that. So it was a logistical triumph. Of course, we had Antwerp functioning then. And I think, one of the reasons why the shortages in September, October kicked off, one of the reasons for why Market Garden was a bit of a challenge was we didn't have that major port. We weren't logistically balanced, and we didn't have huge stocks where we needed them at the right time. And for the Ardennes, that was simply a matter of being able to move everything where we needed, everything we needed in Antwerp. And there were really no shortages. If you're at the front and you were short of particularly winter gear, that was probably one of the major areas where armies learned you needed specialized winter gear. Before then, you put on extra layers. And we're now of the Gore-Tex generation. If it's cold and wet, we don all sorts of special equipment. And that just wasn't available for any side in the 1940s. And so, it was pretty miserable fighting in those conditions. But if you've got logistics on your side, then that helps. So that's a shout for all the loggies, the logisticians.
And just to interrupt, but we British, we joke about Americans always insulting Montgomery and say that we're slow and we always stop for tea, us Brits. But to be fair, we British often say the Americans just throw numbers at everything, and everything they is because they've got lots of stuff. And it's you made a very good point there about the Red Ball Express, and when we did the show about the 4th Armored Division medical units, how intelligently set up they were, how efficient they were, how they got these systems with evacuation via various stages. You can't win a war just by having lots of stuff. You've got to be able to use that stuff well, and that seems to me, by that December period in the ETO, the Americans have got the quantity of stuff, but they also know how to efficiently get it from the Antwerp and the supply ports to the front line, how to operate a system that works. So we ought to be fair, give them Americans credit for inventing some very sound systems there.
Well, we can pick that argument up and move it sideways and look at medical logistics.
Yeah.
And the Americans in theatre have had 6 months from D-Day to learn how to use field hospitals and so on in the field. And a hospital isn't just a hospital. If you're packing up and moving every couple of weeks, that's got to become a slick operation. How the whole supply business of getting more bandages, having enough blood plasma, having well-trained staff, and the fact that they're not all used all at the same time, so they're not all exhausted, so you can stagger your casualties coming in or your treatment, and where you then farm them out to, and where your network of larger field hospitals are, as opposed to sort of MASH units further, much closer to the front. I mean, the Americans have challenges. There's an entire hospital near Bastogne that's captured.
Yeah.
But the all medical units had really cut their teeth. None are really new in theatre, and they all knew how to behave and work, and stagger their shifts and their rosters, so they don't all get exhausted at the same time, which is a common affliction for people fresh into combat. So that really that stands up, because the Americans take horrendous casualties, but they have a medical system that doesn't fall over. So that really makes a difference at the same time as well. I mean, many of us have been to the Ardennes, and it's incredibly uncompromising terrain. It's very, very unhelpful. It's nasty. And the point I made when we started this is that it has microclimates all over the place. You can't take an average of what the temperature will be, the rainfall, whether there'll be snow today or fog here or whatever, because it varies from area to area, even just on a very, very localized basis. So it is one of the nastiest places to conduct any kind of sort of campaign. And the fact the Americans come through it so well just shows you how valid the training is. Now, had this happened a couple of months into the D-Day invasion, I mean, not possible because it's too far away, but had you encountered that kind of terrain with a massive counterattack, then it would have been very, very difficult, because the Allies would have been very unbalanced. We wouldn't have learned all the lessons we needed to. What's striking is how in 1945 the result of the learning process results in lots of new kit, Pershing tanks, for example. But they're not there in the winter of 44. So, the whole iterative process of an army learning is ongoing all the time. This is an army that's very different to the army that had landed on the 6th of June, 1944. And 2nd Infantry Division landed on the 7th of June. James Earl Rudder, who did so well on the Point du Hoc, is now a regimental commander in the 28th. And I mean, they've had a hell of a hammering already in the Hurtgen Forest. And they get a second hammering on the front in the Ardennes. So a lot of people have been through the mill. So this is actually quite a different army. It's much wiser. Yes, there are a lot of veterans around, but they've integrated a lot of newcomers as well. So the 99th Division and the Golden Lions, 106, I mean, they're both very, very new to the front, but there are enough veterans and they're well enough led that even though they take horrendous casualties, they don't fall over. They're not disbanded as divisions. They're resuscitated after the Bulge, because there's enough of a corps worth keeping that reinforcements are fed back into those divisions. So again, we can look at individual units and say, well, they did well, they did poorly. But the fact that they're all kept in being says a lot about the training and the esprit de corps that these units have.
So we're going to talk about your new book, which is taking us through the next 100 days of the war. But before we get to that, were there any fundamental lessons the US Army and perhaps the British as well learnt during the Battle of the Bulge that were going to be vital for those next 100 days? Or did they revert back to form and really kind of go back to the plan they'd had before the Ardennes offensive occurred?
Well, of course, I mean, the Allied plans were to cross the River Rhine, clear the Rhineland, get up to the River Rhine. And that was going to happen in early January 1945. And essentially, the Battle of the Bulge puts all the Allied plans back by about 2 months. What we then see happening is pretty much a carbon copy of what would have happened in January, but now takes place in the middle of March. Clearing of the Rhineland, but particularly the Rhine crossings, which all happened within the same sort of couple of weeks. But the troops, but very much wiser then. And I mean, I think, one thing that really happens in the Bulge, we're used to Normandy being an American sector and a British sector. And the troops don't see much of one another and don't work together very much, if you think about it. And that doesn't happen because they all keep to their own sectors. So, the Montes Blitz going through Belgium in September 1944, it hardly bumps into the Americans at all. But for the Bulge, you get a whole corps, 30 Corps, which is boosted in numbers, moving in and directly dealing and fighting alongside their American compatriots. And there's a lot more cooperation at every level between different arms, between different divisions, and it also it has carried on in the air as well. And that integration we see a lot more of in March and April 1945 as well. And of course, that takes us right through to NATO. So yeah, we talk a lot about Allied interoperability, but it doesn't really take place until the Bulge through pressure of necessity. And the fact it works just says an awful lot about the Allied approach. There's a Wilco nature on both sides. I mean, if we look at the historiography, it's very, very easy for historians of British or American heritage and the Canadians to pick holes and say, you did this or you didn't do that, or Montgomery, yada, yada, yada. But in fact, I think there's an awful lot far more that's positive that you take away from this, and particularly the Allies learning to fight alongside one another. But a point I will...
Sorry. Well, I mean, and that working together is always improved when you've been through bad times. The adversity, in a sense, since June the 6th, things have more or less been going the Allied way. There's been some stumbles along the way, but, the Battle of the Bulge, we talked about it. It was a complete surprise. And as you say, the Allies had to react to it. And the British and Americans, and we're reminding ourselves that there are Canadians watching, the Canadians get involved as well, the Canadian Parachute Battalion, what have you. It's in adversity that you find your true strength. That's where you find who you can rely on. I think probably on a purely sort of psychological level, the British, Canadian, and Americans come out of the Bulge with a bit more togetherness, perhaps, than they'd had before, because they had been up against it together as one force. Does that ring bells with you?
I mean, totally. So the great controversy is the meeting in Verdun 3 days after the attack, where the Allies get together, led by Eisenhower, and the result of that is he divides the Bulge into two, and Montgomery is left to tidy up the northern half, and Bradley is given command of the southern half. There's a lot of finger pointing about at Montgomery's taking over of the Northern American corps and divisions. Those who served under him, particularly Collins, Ridgway, at that moment thought that he was absolutely the professional hand you needed. It falls apart and goes away again, that sense of unity. Later on into 1945, but it's a sense that there's a wily old professional who understands exactly how to maneuver forces at the sort of higher level, at the operational level. And I suppose the proof of the pudding is it worked. Now, it very nearly didn't work when on the 7th of January, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters in Holland, Belgium, at Zonhoven, and said, "Oh well, this was a tricky little battle, one of the most interesting I've ever had to fight," and implied that he had won it and British forces had won it, and he has to be ticked off by Churchill personally in the House of Commons, who says, of every 20 people who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, 19 were Americans, and the British really played a very small role. But that is a very definite personal attack on Montgomery and telling him to get back in his box. But by and large, the end result is very positive for Allied unity. Now, if I can pick up that thread and say, well, what about German unity? Or German understanding of Allied unity. I mean, this is the real reason why Hitler attacks. He says to everybody, if we go to Antwerp, the Allies will blame each other for letting this happen. And the Anglo-American Canadian coalition will fall apart. And he says this on several occasions. And that's clearly his rationale. But of course it doesn't. And it's more a reflection on Hitler. He thinks that's what coalitions are all about. One party is dominant and everybody else is subservient, because that's the way he behaves.
Yeah, it's his model.
And militarily and diplomatically. And yet the Allies, what have the Allies got? They've got SHAEF, led by Eisenhower, full of Brits and Canadians as assistant chiefs of staff. And SHAEF is 20,000 strong, all ranks. And that's got to completely disintegrate, and they've got to hate each other for that coalition to fall apart. And Hitler just never gets that. He never, ever understands that. And don't forget how disunified OKW is. And the Luftwaffe and the Navy and the Army and the SS all hating each other. So, if that's where the Germans are going to come from, they're never going to prevail. But Hitler's mentality is that competition is how the Allies work as well, and therefore they're ripe for a nudge to fall apart, and that's what doesn't happen. So the whole thing is built on his misunderstanding and his arrogance, and if anything, this is the triumph of Allied solidarity, because when SHAEF eventually winds down and we have the occupation of Germany, in a very short space of time, within 4 years, that becomes NATO. And all the lessons of NATO arise from the way SHAEF operated against a really stubborn enemy in 1944 to 45. So that, the Bulge goes much, much further. It delivers us NATO in a way that Normandy never did.
And that's a very good point about SHAEF there, because we can't assess SHAEF in the same way we can assess Eisenhower or Montgomery, because SHAEF can't make a quote. SHAEF can't say something at a meeting, because, as you say, SHAEF is 20,000 personnel, and it's a good time to pay tribute to those people who are working behind the scenes. We've talked about the intelligence aspect of it, but just that clerical aspect that the Allied army is running with now, that, as you make the very point, the German army is not running with a very efficient behind the scenes operation. Everybody's hating each other, everybody's distrustful of each other, but at its heart, the Allies have this kind of bureaucratic, but that's a negative word, bureaucratic in a good sense of the word, this organizing capacity behind it. And we make the mistake sometimes of talking too much about the personalities, the big ones at the top, the Montgomerys, the Bradleys, the Eisenhowers, and not talking about this group of men and women who are actually working there 7 days a week as a collective to facilitate this efficiency. So is that something we overlook at our peril, really, this office part of the organization?
Well, I think we're blinded by personalities.
Yeah.
We're blinded by the teeth arms, as I said earlier. And, reading what I write, you'll see that, one of the things I like doing is peering behind the scenes at all the, the unsung facilitators and the other organizations on the battlefield that make it happen. I mean, to get all the armor from A to B for the Germans, they use the German rail system, Deutsches Reichsbahn, whenever they can. Otherwise, the panzers have to clatter around on their tracks, and that's unnecessary wear and tear. The Allies move everything by tank transporters. And, the British Army has, 400 or 500 tank transporters. The Americans, about 2,000, I think. We never talk about their war, the armored delivery regiments. but they perform this vital, task. And with Remy, the Brits are evacuating tanks as well, damaged tanks. I mean, all those organisations that keep the show on the road.
Yeah.
You suddenly realise that there's huge parts of the Allied machine that just don't get a look in. Now, I'm not quite sure whether I'm correct here with the figures, but if you talk about 20 men in the Allied armies, then around about 18 or 19 of them will be supporting arms to keep that one tanker, artilleryman, or infantryman up the front in blankets, in beans and bullets, is the American Transportation Corps sort of phrase. And they very rarely get a look in. So if we go back to the Red Ball Express again, they're mobilized. Most of them are African Americans, black soldiers, who are doing a pretty boring job driving their trucks around. But they were intensely proud of what they had achieved, both in the Red Ball Express, but also in the Bulge, where they end up doing exactly the same thing. And without them, the Allies can't operate. So, unlikely for me, but I was reading Whitney Houston's biography. And
mind blown. Okay.
As one does. And her father had been a member of the Red Ball Express. And he had told her of his World War II service and the fact that the proudest thing he had ever done was to keep the Allied armies in beans and bullets in the Battle of the Bulge. So there are all these interesting figures with walk-on parts, and it's the it's the unsung heroes, the unsung units. So we talk about the Canadians in the Battle of the Bulge. We know about the Canadian Parachute Battalion, which is part of 6th Airborne Division. There are 2 battalions of Canadian Foresters, whose job is literally doing what they would do back home, chopping down trees to make corduroy roads and telegraph poles and all the rest of it, who get caught up. But they are, they're used to harsh conditions. They've got, they're well equipped in terms of clothing and boots for that kind of Ardennes weather, and they do extremely well. There's a unique battalion of Norwegian Americans. They've all migrated to the United States in the 1920s, 1930s. They all come with gruff accents. And with all the confusion caused by Skorzény's commandos, you can imagine how these Norwegian Americans would have sounded to an ordinary GI who's suspicious of everyone who sounds even vaguely German. And they soldier on and they do remarkably well. But, all the time, every single checkpoint, you're going to wonder if you're a Norwegian American, whether this is your last moment, because do I
remember enough about baseball to get through this, this checkpoint?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd be first in line to be shot, never mind a Norwegian. So there are all these different aspects of the Bulge, and that's why with so many Americans serving there, and a substantial British Corps and Canadians, the Belgians do all the rear area securities, the Belgian army just getting back into gear, and some Frenchmen as well. So, I mean, it is very much an Allied effort. But I'm aware that I've overlarded our cake. I've put lots of lovely steaming melted butter on our toast with lots of generous helpings of marmalade. And we need to be a bit more critical. So, where could we point the finger? Allied intelligence. Clearly, there's an over-reliance on what's coming from Bletchley Park. There is a court of inquiry afterwards. No heads roll, which is very unusual. One might have thought someone like Kenneth Strong, who's Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, might fall on his sword. It is pretty much a whitewash, but the end result is we're getting all the material. The material, when you go back through it, does talk about the concentration of units. It does talk about troop movements. It talks about train movements, because Deutsches Reichsbahn also use the Enigma machine. So there are a lot of indicators there. What we've done is, to use that lovely phrase, we've situated the appreciation. In other words, we've decided what the end result is, and we make the facts fit our intelligence picture. So for us today, the Bulge is always used as an example of how not to conduct intelligence. You need checks and balances. You need things like aerial recce photographs. You need signals intelligence. You need prisoner of war interrogations to test what your strategic intelligence is telling you, in this case, Bletchley Park. And we were too lax. And there was this sense that the war is nearly over, and we know what the intelligence picture is. So we get, completely caught out. The corollary of that is in April 1945. We're convinced that the Germans are going to flee to an Alpine redoubt in the mountains in Bavaria, centered on Berchtesgaden, and it's all kitted out, ready for the Third Reich to carry on. And of course, that's nonsense. But because Strong and the whole Allied intelligence chain has been caught out once in the Ardennes by just not seeing it, they're not going to be caught out again. And so we build in. The whole of Patton's Third Army moves down that way, and the whole of Patch's Seventh Army also moves in that direction, just in case the Germans got an Alpine redoubt. They don't happen to have one, but we're not going to throw caution to the wind again. So that's one of the lessons that comes out. But yeah, certainly intelligence was found wanting for all sorts of different reasons.
But isn't that part of in recent historiography, we have talked a lot about intelligence. We've talked a lot about ultra in the last sort of 10, 20 years. And maybe out of that, we've come away with this idea that it's a perfect science, which of course it isn't. Intelligence builds a picture, and then you have to commanders in the field have to use what they're seeing with their own eyes to build on that. So maybe it's time now to kind of come off our high about intelligence and realize that it was a marvelous tool when it worked, but also it could in this, as it did in this case, not forewarn us. But because, as we said, the Battle of the Bulge ended up being an Allied victory, I suppose there wasn't really any need to go back and look at that intelligence failure. If we had been defeated, if the Germans had miracle upon miracle got to Antwerp, there would have been some kind of court of inquiry, so to speak, because it ended up a victory. And there's other things to do in that. As you said, we've got to focus on getting over the Rhine. There was no need to kind of go back and rake over it, I suppose.
Well, I mean, this brings us right up to date. There are so many different vibes coming out of the Bulge. But I mean, today, for our listeners in Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, we've got a huge build-up along a border that we're trying to investigate. What we're not sure of is what the intention is. It's overt rather than covert as it was in 1944. But our intelligence picture of what the Russians may or may not do and how the Ukrainians may fare were there to be a war. And I think my personal view is we're at a sort of Cuban Missile Crisis type event, that negotiation will unravel or not. But we need to be prepared for, huge headlines of masses of advances in the East and major casualties. And I don't see anyone, even remotely embracing that as likely at the moment. But all our lessons and our understanding of how intelligence works, the conclusions we can draw, the way we test our intelligence conclusions that we should have done in 1944, are incredibly valid today at this very moment in time. And that's why I'm not just a military historian, but a current affairs analyst, because that's where your knowledge and your understanding of how these things works comes from, and that's its relevance to today. I might go on and sort of say, well, Skorzeny then advises some of the Arab nations throughout the 1950s, and if you look at the Six-Day War in 1966 and the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, they are built on plans that look remarkably similar to the Battle of the Bulge. And again, that is the result of senior Germans, not just Skorzeny, advising the Arab nations. So surprise attacks at a time of holiday, Yom Kippur, is like Christmas 1944. So it's no coincidence that some of those attacks on Israel are modeled on the Battle of the Bulge very, very directly. And if we look at, the Ardennes today, They were used throughout the Cold War period when I was a serving officer, and many here I know have served, many I know will have served in the Ardennes on those big NATO exercises, which were a rehearsal for the Russians coming steaming through. Well, why did we use the Ardennes? Because the terrain and the woodlands is a dead ringer for the Fulda Gap, which was one of the major areas that the Russians were expected to stream into West Germany. So we used the terrain of a past battlefield to rehearse a future war were it to happen. And the link for me was I had to dig into a bit of the Ardennes in the early 1980s. As a platoon commander, I laid out my platoon position, my section positions. I found myself digging into a dip near a railway viaduct, and as we dug down, we found it was actually a platoon position from 1944, because we dug down into old ration tins, bits of US military clobber that were no longer needed, and cartridges and ammunition. And it validated my choice of position, because I realized that that's what the GIs had done in anger in 1944.
Ground doesn't change, does it?
I was doing that, off my own bat, as a rehearsal for defending a similar position against the Russians in 1982. So these things come around in full circles, and the Bulge isn't an isolated campaign. It ripples through all the way through the Cold War and right up to today.
That's a really good point, because there are some battles from the war you can say maybe that's got nothing that can teach us today, 77 years on. Others you can go, actually, that one we can learn a lot from. But we had a couple of questions about some of the figures that come out of the Battle of the Bulge. We touched on Montgomery a little bit, but someone asked about Bradley. But just kind of before we morph into the stage of what happened next, who do you think are the kind of heroes and villains of the Bulge campaign? When we talk about the Pattons and the Bradleys and the Montgomerys, who's in Peter's heroes list and who's in Peter's could do better, come and see headmaster after class list?
Well, are we just looking at the Allied side, or are we
either? Yeah,
well?
Floor's yours.
Well, I mean, the Germans could have put together a better campaign with the small solution, which would have been to knock us for 6 in the Aachen area, and people like von Manteuffel were extremely able soldiers. The trouble is, Hitler wasn't taking any kind of adjustment to his plan. He's in stark raving bonkers mode. And he's also latched onto this battlefield where he'd done so well in 1940. So, and the trouble is, he's now dictating right down to tactical level. He's dictating the hour at which you start, how long the preliminary bombardment lasts for, the positioning of troops. I mean, that's absolutely bonkers, because he's got no sense of terrain. He's never commanded at that level, but everyone's far too frightened of him. And this goes right back, which is where I start the book, to the aftermath of the 20th of July, 1944. Yeah. That's the turning circle when the German army no longer has the courage to turn around to Hitler and say, no, mein Führer. Because if you say no, mein Führer, after the 20th of July, that's regarded as treason. That disloyalty is no longer constructive criticism. It's treason. It's treachery. And therefore, those people, the opportunities for confronting the Führer and trying to make a difference have gone. And no one really has the courage, because they know that, not only could they pay with their lives, but their families' lives are on the line as well. So that really does away with even constructive criticism coming from the German army with the best of intentions. So you're never going to be able to do anything more than you achieved in the Bulge from the German side. From the Allied point of view, yeah, it's easy to get to get carried away with the senior commanders. I was surprised how poor Hodges was in the First U.S. Army during the Bulge. I find him a difficult person to like. There's an account of the First Army headquarters called A Command Post at War, which points out that Hodges is not a very collaborative character. His chief of staff is quite strong, but they are incredibly difficult as a headquarters to integrate and to encourage the best from their troops. Hodges seems to have had a nervous breakdown when the bulge comes in. And from several different sources, we know that he issued no orders for about 3 days. He was suffering probably from flu, but it was his chief of staff who did everything. And so I may be being unkind to him, but he didn't come out of this at all well. And I'm surprised he stays on as a commander right until the end of the war. But Bradley is in awe of him. He's senior to Bradley. Bradley calls him sir all the way through. If you read Bradley's memoirs, he talks about Courtney all the time, and their telephone conversations are very matey. But I've heard it from other sources that he called him sir all the time, as a sort of an officer who was senior in years to him, if not in rank. And I think there's a very difficult sort of relationship there. So he doesn't come out of this well. George Patton comes out of it well because George Patton shouts very well about himself. And we don't need to go that much further. He swings 2 corps round and reorientates them through 90 degrees from facing east to facing north. We all know about that. It's probably the corps commanders there who are, the absolute champions. And it's easy to get carried away by that turn of advance, moving the axis of advance. Now, General Devers, who's commanding the 6th Army Group in April 1945, achieves that with 2 armies. So we think of Patton doing that just with 2 corps. Other people do the same on a far more spectacular basis a few months later. But we're more familiar with Patton's turning movement, and that's simply the publicity that he brings to Third Army, and the way he shouts and writes about himself. Nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that those generals who are less inclined to shout about themselves and their armies, who are less adept at publicity, get left out of the history tale. And that's why historians like me like to delve a little bit further behind the scenes and pull out those who are less well known.
Well, that came up with my show with Don Fox about the 4th Armored Division, because it was a blessing that they were under Patton's 3rd Army, and also a curse. The blessing was they were able to be part of that force to turn and go up towards the pocket. But of course, the curse was they didn't get any credit for it, because, as you said in the first show, and Steve Sloger said it, whenever the Germans refer to the 3rd Army, it's Patton's 3rd Army. And so it's always Patton's tanks, when in fact it was the command of the 4th Armored Division, who of course has just changed because Wood has gone and Gaffey comes in. So Don feels that as a division they are just lumped in with Patton, and what they did in terms of their own input to that northerly route has kind of been overshadowed by Patton's own being the top of the Christmas tree, to use an appropriate time of year pun.
Yeah, I mean, this is where you look at the chiefs of staff, because they're the real guys who make things happen. Patton has 2, Gaffey, you just mentioned, who's one of those rare individuals who's as good a chief of staff and administrator as he is a combat commander, because he then leaves Patton's headquarters, goes off to command his armored division, and does just as well with that. And he's replaced by Hobart Gay, who writes a very good account of Third Army's war, which I had a look at the Military History Institute in Carlisle. Gay's really interesting because, he points out that by the end of the Second World War, Third Army is nearly 500,000 strong. Now, that's larger than any other Allied army. It's larger than the First, for example. It's larger than Dempsey's Second. So part of what they achieve is due to this enormous size. And I mean, they grow and grow and grow, and they end up with 4 corps. They don't have 4 corps in the bulge. But if we're talking about reputations and achievements, size matters, and they have more than anyone else. And if you shout loud enough and you ask persistently, then you will receive, and that's what Patton's very good at. But we're drifting slightly away from the bulge. But I think the the lower you go down in your sort of range of heroes, the easier it is to pick out the individuals. But divisional commanders, it makes quite a good study of who does well and who does poorly. And if you look at the end results, so Anthony McAuliffe commanding, he's the divisional artillery commander of the 101st at Bastogne. I mean, he does well enough to achieve his own division, which was by no means on the cards, within a month, and that gives him a leg up. There are a lot of people, Hoger, who will go on and seize Remagen Bridge. Van Fleet is another who's a divisional commander at this stage. He'll be a corps commander before the end of the war. I mean, there are still people in November, December who are full colonels, about to become brigadier generals, who will make 1 or 2 star rank before the Second World War is over, and within 10 years will be a full 4-star general. So it's your stellar performance tested in the middle of combat in the Bulge, which is really going to make some careers and break others. One of the cavalry group commanders just doesn't cut the mustard, falls apart in front of the chain of command and is relieved at the spot. That's opposite the SS Panzer Army, the 6th SS.
Yeah. So, going back to what we said earlier about what happened next, it was, I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, a good time for the Allies to kind of shuffle their pack, so to speak, and see which commanders have proved their worth and see which ones perhaps need to be sent back. Wood, we talked about with 4th Armored, was relieved, went back to train armored troops, because it is a slightly differently organized and commanded force that then does move towards the Rhine River. So it was kind of a trimming down and an opportunity for Allies to kind of reassess. So do you think the army that then pushed on towards the Rhine that you're writing, or you're just about to publish about now, did that army go forward with some benefits that are taken away from the Ardennes?
I'm sure it has done. It also goes away with the knowledge that, nearly all of them fought the Germans and wrote the Germans down. So the immense reserves that the Germans throw into the Ardennes would have otherwise stayed behind the River Rhine, and everybody would have had a really nasty crossing of the Rhine, and then counterattacks coming in left, right, and centre, and whatever Army Group B was capable of doing, it would have thrown at an Allied invasion of Western Germany, and the war would have carried on at least until June, if not later. So the Germans write down their own reserves, and I think that gives you great confidence because everybody would have been aware of that. There's almost no panzers left in the West after the Bulge. Huge amounts of elite troops who've been really well trained and well equipped, all the assault rifles and everything else, they've been lost. And so what you've got is a ragtag of different units, very few of whom can be reinforced. And so you've now got a lot of, Hitler Youth and Volkssturm and all the rest of it who are going to be lurking behind the River Rhine. And of course, the one equation that we keep out of our considering the Battle of the Bulge, you've still got the Russians on the Eastern Front. Well, they're in abeyance because they steam through with Operation Bagration, which has cost them so much that they have to have a huge operational pause. And then they'll storm through to the River Oder again. But again, there's another operational pause because the way the Russians work it is, victory at all costs. So they take masses of casualties. So they do these spectacular advances, but they then have to have a pause because they've lost so many men, they've lost so many vehicles, equipment, tanks, guns, you name it. Because the human doesn't matter. The human doesn't matter in the Russian frame of mind. That's the way the Soviets and Stalin work and think. And the Bulge happens during one of those pauses, and that's why the Germans can send as many forces to the west as possible. But they know that the Russians are about to sort of reattack, get their act together, and will assault towards Berlin in the new year. And that's really what brings about the end of the Bulge. In the third week in January 1945, Hitler says, right, all the armor is coming out because I need it in the east to defend Berlin. And the moment you've done that, then that sort of knocks the stuffing out of the whole rationale of the Bulge. And don't forget, he starts by saying the reason we're doing this is to get to Antwerp and divide the Allies. And then middle of January, he says, right, I'm withdrawing the armor because we've done what we intended to do, which was unbalance the Allies in the West. But that's not what he started out saying he was going to do. So he's changed the goalpost straight away. He just said, well, I want to buy some operational time while we go and hit the Russians, and then we might come back and have another look at the West. So he's bonkers. He's completely changing the goalpost there. But that then triggers or allows the Allies to start pinching off the Bulge. And of course, the two Allied army, basically the Brits and the Americans, meet in the middle of the Bulge. And that's around about the same sort of time. So we're talking, the middle of January 1945. Now, when does the Bulge technically end? Does it end when you get back to where everything started? The front lines are completely restored? Well, that's early February. Is it when the German combat power is largely negated and the Bulge begins to be pinched off? That's the middle of January. What the American historians have done is actually, I think, a sleight of hand, and it's quite clever. I accepted the 28th of January as the end of the Bulge, and technically that's the end of the Bulge campaign. So you get your campaign streamer if you're a unit, you get your medal if you fought up to that date. Where's the 28th of January come from? If you start with VE Day and you count back 100 days to VE Day starts on the 28th of January. So it's a sort of arbitrary date you can quibble with. And that's how I start the beginning of my next book, which is Fire and Steel, the end of the war in World War II, the end of the European war in World War II. And it's the story of the last 100 days. And it begins on that 8th of January. But that's where that date comes from. And it doesn't really mean it's the end of the Bulge because there's more fighting. There are more casualties to be sustained. And the front lines aren't fully restored until early February. So, again, we have an odd name, an odd time. We also don't know what we're going to call it. Is it the Ardennes campaign? Because the campaign streamers for fighting in the Battle of the Bulge are called the Ardennes. And there's another one called Alsace, and that's for fighting another German incursion into 7th Army's area, which was called Nordwind. And so it's a sort of fusion of the two. So what do we call it? And it's Patton who does come up with the idea of a bulge into the Allied lines, and a very clever newsman then turns that into the Battle of the Bulge, and that's how that comes out, even before it's finished. So that's a story circulating, towards the middle part of January. So all these things we take for granted when it ends, where it got its name. Actually, when you dig, they're not nearly so easily laid out, and there's a story behind them.
Which is why your book's always the size they are, because you include these details, and as you said earlier, you include the details of these other units that don't always make the big books, the forestry units, the road makers, the intelligence, the SHAEF personnel, because it's easy to kind of just talk about the frontline infantry and the fighter bombers and the tanks and things, but as you said, that's only a small percentage of the Allied army at this point, so it's important to cover them all. But you conveniently brought up your next book and the 100 days of fighting that happened, and I was doing a little bit of research over the last few days about that last part of the war, and the first remark is there isn't as much on the internet about that part as there is Normandy and Market Garden and the Bulge. But what I did find, some people suggesting, why did it take 4 months? My God, couldn't we have wrapped it up much quicker? And other people saying, my God, it only took 4 months. So it seems there's two kind of opinions about the speed that campaign took. You talked about the fact the Germans have lost a lot of armor. You've been specifically asked to talk about the loss of the Luftwaffe and how the Bulge and Bodenplatte affects the Luftwaffe. But without giving away the whole of your book, which will be impossible in a few minutes of conversation, that 4 months, were the Allies fast? Were they slow? Was it about the time it was going to take? What's your opinion on kind of the time scale?
Well, let me just pick up on Bodenplatte and the Luftwaffe first before I forget. The whole idea of Hitler's attack going in is that it happens when Allied air can't operate. And to support that, the idea was going to be that the Luftwaffe would additionally attack all the Allied airfields. But that was at the beginning of the campaign. And somehow or other, Bodenplatte is never switched off. So it gets resurrected for the 1st of January. And the idea is you attack every Allied air base when all the pilots are nursing a sore head after a New Year's Eve celebration. And that, that's perfectly logical, and that's partly what happens. But that attack should never have gone in. That should have gone in on the first day of the Bulge or just before it, when Allied air power is, additionally negated, rather than on New Year's Day. Because, if the weather is good enough for you to fly, it's good enough for your opponents to fly. And so what we get is the last hurrah of the Luftwaffe, staggering losses, not just in aircraft, but seasoned pilots. And because of the security that surrounds the whole Bulge, which applies to Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe operation, no one can tell anyone else what's happening. You can't warn German air defense that this lot is going in. So huge numbers of German fighters are shot down by German air defense, which is bonkers. But that's what really kills off the Luftwaffe. It absolutely slays the fighter arm, and they're never able to operate in large numbers again. You've lost something like 75% of your seasoned pilots and 50% of your pilots overall. Never mind the airframes. Never mind all the fuel that represents.
Yeah.
And so that is neutered in a day, less than a day. And that would be an awesome amount of air power that could have been deployed sort of later on. So to go back to your original question, what happens next? What really struck me about 1945 and the campaign in the West is how ad hoc it was. We know that we end up along the line of the River Elbe. That's sort of vaguely in the Allied plans arranged before we cross the River Rhine. But the details of that aren't really tied up because the Russians won't tell us any of their secrets, won't tell us where they are. And the actual Allied stop lines aren't agreed until we're nearly there, until we're 50 miles away. The decision not to go to Berlin is only decided by Eisenhower personally at the end of March. And that reflects the fact that it's going to be hugely costly in terms of Allied casualties for urban warfare. You can't use Allied air power over a city, so you lose that valuable aspect of your armory. The staggering number of Russians who are close to Berlin, 2.5 million. I'm quite happy to sit down and debate the merits of the Allies, the Western Allies attacking Berlin, because to me it's an absolute non-starter, even though people like Ridgway, who were going to parachute in, were convinced right until the end. So much of that historiography is seen through the lens of the Cold War. Yeah. And had we taken Berlin, then the Cold War would have been different. Absolute nonsense. It's just a non-starter. We're going to hand most of that terrain back to the Russians as agreed at Yalta. But more importantly, we just don't have the capability to absorb. The Russians don't lose 100,000 casualties taking Berlin. They lose more like 400,000. And the Allies just aren't in the league to be prepared to stand that at all. We certainly don't have those kind of reserves of manpower. So, that's a non-starter. And yet there's this huge debate. Eisenhower, to my mind, comes up with the right decision. It's a very brave one. A lot of Americans take it personally that they're not allowed to be in at the kill, but he saves their lives, does Ike. The Brits take it extremely badly. Montgomery complaining to Churchill and over his head to Roosevelt direct. That's really bad form as an army group commander. but it's not a national agenda. It's all about sort of saving lives and playing to your strengths. And I was really surprised that is an issue as late as 3 weeks before the Second World War ends. So the campaign in Western Germany is very, very ad hoc. It chops and changes. There are all sorts of other surprises. The idea of werewolves. We had never ever thought that the Germans might be storing up trouble, training people to assassinate us once we've gone in and occupied Germany. It turns out they hadn't. But this is all a sort of bit of a Goebbels smokescreen. But when the Germans suddenly announced this on radio, as though it's all set up and about to happen, goodness me, that puts the wind up the Western up in the minds of the Western allies. So that comes as a huge shocker. The French pull a few blinders in terms of we don't even expect them to have an occupation zone. And when de Gaulle not only says we've got an occupation zone and then commands his armies to start taking towns and terrain that have been allocated to the Americans, and there are, really difficult confrontations at political level. And all of this sort of erupts just in the last couple of months, March and sort of April. There are a lot of blind sides. There's a lot of real excitement and drama I just hadn't appreciated in those last 100 days that no one had anticipated. But we go back to, where we started talking tonight, which is the Allies are so good at getting together and ironing out problems, about understanding where clashes of personalities are and learning how to deal with them. So we have, really good liaison officers in place. American liaison officers to the French are fluent French speakers who've studied at the French École de Guerre, and they know their opposite numbers. All of that makes a huge difference. It's not something the Germans could have ever replicated or would have ever been minded to replicate. So again, it's a triumph of Allied experience. But look at the terrain we're dealing with. We're crossing the Rhine in March. We're going through the open terrain of Western Germany in March, April. By the end of April, we're in the Austrian Alps. We're indulging in mountain warfare. I mean, this is really where Eagle's Dare comes alive. It's exactly that sort of kind of terrain. So, and these are all the same units. They don't have special equipment. And whether you're looking at the Brits, Canadians, French, or Americans, I mean, straight away we're in a very, very multinational army, and it does particularly well. But I mean, the big surprise, Woody, was sitting down and writing this. The overwhelming memory that everyone had who fought in that campaign, and I caught a lot speaking to them. So you'll see a lot of my own sort of interviews with eyewitnesses, is how many of them came across the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And we think of just a few camps like Dachau and Buchenwald and Mauthausen. But if you realize the Germans are controlling a slave network of 12.5 million people, nearly all of whom are in some kind of camp or other, 1 in 4 of everybody working in German industry is a slave laborer. That's what people come across. And they, the average Allied soldier doesn't know the difference between a concentration camp and a work camp because they're all treated equally poorly.
Yeah.
And if you lump that all together as the Holocaust, then of Eisenhower's 4 million Allied soldiers or service personnel, which is what he has at the end, nearly all of them bump into slave laborers. They all are confronted by the Holocaust. And the worst slave camp is as bad as Dachau or Belsen or Buchenwald. And so enormous numbers come across this, and they are traumatized. I mean, we just don't recognize. No, those who come back from prisoner of war camps, we can understand that they've been through a particularly traumatic experience. But those soldiers liberating a straightforward labor camp, where the abuse has been incredibly poor, incredibly bad, and those people are dying in high numbers. There's no post-traumatic stress disorder recognized. There's no treatments. There's no psychotherapy. And those people come back in the most appalling state. Yeah. Nordhausen, all those, tunnels carved into mountains where they're assembling V weapons. It's just a sort of hint of it. I suppose most minds might go to Band of Brothers with the penultimate episode when they liberate what are actually the Kaufering camps around Landsberg. I mean, that's all based on reality, but that's just one page of Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers. But that writ large is the same for nearly every American, British, Canadian, and French formation. They all come across these. And they're all equally nasty. I mean, Kaufering wasn't a concentration camp. It wasn't a murder or death camp.
Yeah.
It was a labor camp and was a sort of subsection of Mauthausen or Dachau. So those were, I mean, you know, you watch the episode, which is close to the photographs that you will see. And yet that's where all slave laborers from all around the world were being, you know, systematically worked to death. And the only difference, and GI put this rather well, was the slave labor camps were where you killed the still useful, rather than you murdered the non-useful straight away in a concentration camp. And I know this is very difficult territory to abbreviate, but I spent more time than I had anticipated looking at that experience, the labor camps, and of course the concentration camps that we're all familiar with. And I didn't expect it to be as large a part of my final book of
if you hadn't mentioned the discovery of the camps, I was going to ask you about it anyway, because there was that debate on Twitter before Christmas about whether or not teaching the Holocaust should be separate from teaching military history, part of it, or separate museums. And I'm firmly that they should be taught together. And when you're writing about that last 4 months of the war in Europe, you can't avoid the Holocaust. I mean, as you said there, a lot of Allied soldiers would have come across it. I did a show about Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde was never the same again after experiencing what he'd seen there at Belsen. And so, that episode, in Band of Brothers, Why We Fight, that was the thing. Anybody who had been, you've been fighting since Normandy, perhaps, you're getting a little bit pissed off, you want to go back home to New York or London or Edinburgh, wherever it would be, and you kind of why is it still us, until you start to experience exactly what that other part of the Third Reich had been doing, that the willful extermination of races, and suddenly it galvanized what these soldiers were there for, and the realization that all that effort, all that trial and tribulation, all the cold weather, all the K rations, all the compo had kind of been worth it. So I remember you saying on Twitter a few weeks ago when you were writing it, how the same thing you just said, that you didn't know you were going to be tackling that much of the Holocaust aspect. But to me, incredibly important that those two parts of the war come crashing together in those last few months. Because we do know that history is written about separately. There are people who write about the Holocaust, and our mutual friend Alina and people like that who talk about that. And then there's the other guys who write about, and girls who write about the battles. But here, so they come colliding together. So when you were speaking, looking at the interviews you're going back to some of the figures again, the divisional commanders, corps commanders, I'm assuming that you see a change in how they write about the war post seeing some of the results of what the Third Reich were doing, as opposed to before. They can see things in a purely kind of combat level before that, and then they see those camps. Did you see that in your research?
Yeah, well, I mean, you only have to look at all the accounts that the commanders from Eisenhower and Bradley down leave. Everything changes that, whatever it is, second week in April 1945, when Third Army come across a small camp called Ohrdruf, which is near Gotha, near Weimar. And that's the first concentration camp, really. It isn't technically a concentration camp. It's a satellite of Buchenwald. But it's the first major camp the Allies come across where there are piles of dead bodies, obvious indication of abuse, execution of the inhabitants as the SS Scarpa, literally hours before the Americans arrive. But a huge illustration of this network of camps, of which the Allies really don't aren't prepared for. Yes, we know about Auschwitz, we know about Gross-Rosen, we know about the other camps that the Soviets had documented, all the the evidence presented by the Poles. I'm not sure it had really registered militarily. I don't think SHAEF really has a Scooby, any idea at all about what all of this means. There isn't a war crimes department that's been established at that stage. Invading Germany in 1945 is a bit like approaching an archaeological dig. We know something has happened there. We have no idea of the wide network of camps, what they've decided to achieve. We have no idea how many people have passed through them. We know Hitler has been nasty to the Jews. He's abused a lot of people. We have no idea of the scale of this. We've no idea that the major concentration camps each had over 100 satellites, which are miniature versions of the same horror. So when you approach this clean field of an archaeological dig that is Germany 1945, you've no idea what's beneath the surface. And the only way you'll find out is by digging, is by stumbling over the camps one by one. And even then, we don't piece it all together until after the war. We don't understand the difference between a labor camp and a concentration camp, and technically a death camp, which is what some of those were, uncovered by the Soviets in the East. But all of them are within the frontiers of Germany because they're designed to enrich the German economy. This is where you bring slaves from other countries, house them in appalling conditions, get them to work for the German war economy for as long as they can live and be useful, and then you kill them, or you kill them through neglect. And that's why 25% of the German workforce even in 1945, are non-Germans kept in appalling conditions. But none of that is obvious until we cross the Rhine. And then once we stumble over one, everyone, massive horror. All the newsreels go, all the journalists go and talk about it. Patton goes there with Bradley. What Patton doesn't tell you is that he steps behind a building to vomit 3 times, old blood and guts. I mean, it really is appalling. But it's so unexpected. And then a week later, we uncover Buchenwald. And the Allies begin to think, what on earth is it that the Germans have created? No idea. And this is when the Holocaust and the military machine meet. And at soldier level, if you've experienced that or you've read about it, you're not going to start taking prisoners. So that the ability to be nice to German civilians whose homes have been bombed, or poor little old Volkssturm men in their 50s who really shouldn't be carrying a weapon or being in uniform, all of that good feeling goes out of the window because the shock and surprise of what it is that we're in, and that shock continues to multiply. With no idea of the scale of these camps, and it just goes on and on. The other awful thing is once you arrive and you start feeding people, and tending to their needs, you can't stop them dying because you simply don't have the resources. As you arrive at somewhere like Belsen, and it's packed with 30, 40, 50,000 people. You don't have the resources to suddenly make them all well again. And they're dying in front of you, and you can't arrest that process. And that's the case at every camp because typhus has broken out in nearly every situation. And you can't sort of stop that. And the fact you have to then bottle these people up because you can't let them out of the wire magnifies the problem because they're seen to be incarcerated by another group of people. And that's horrible. And some of that tension comes out in the Band of Brothers. You start feeding these people and you'll kill them because they've been so emaciated. And you have to leave them in the wire. How are they going to think? What are your own soldiers going to think about that? So, and this all reflects the fact we have no idea in advance what we're about to uncover. And I don't think we could have found a way of knowing that. And I don't think we could have put aside all the resources because the scale of this, we're dealing with hindsight, you and I, Alina, everybody else watching and listening knows this.
This brings up this idea when you talked earlier about the rather arbitrary final date of the Battle of the Bulge, which, it could be a week early, it could be, when do you define it? It's like we talked about, your 100 days of the war to VE Day as being the end of the conflict. But as you said there, this awful experience of the Holocaust just morphs into another human tragedy that carries on for at least 2 or 3 years with the displacement camps and all that mopping up, sorting out medical program. We had a show with Claire Aubin last year about the DP camps, and all of that carries on way beyond the date that the surrender is signed. Okay, not the same. As you said, the killing stops, but the dying doesn't stop. The illness doesn't stop. The loss doesn't end. The homes do not get rebuilt immediately. And so, taking this back to your writing process. I mean, another thing that seems kind of trivial now we've talked about the Holocaust, but another thing that you must be tackling or have tackled with this last book is the sheer variety of terrain. Yeah, you touched on it with the mountain warfare in that, you've got that last part of the war up in the northern part of the Netherlands where it's flat and water and canals. You've got river crossings. You've got massive, great urban battles. As you say, thankfully, the Russians ended up doing Berlin, but there are other big German cities that had to be taken by others. Then you've got the mountains. Then you've got the forests. I mean, you must have been stretching your kind of terrain understanding by touching those last 4 months, because it's an incredible variety of different types of terrain the Allies had to face.
I mean, there's endless amphibious operations. Yeah. I mean, you've got major river crossings, not just of the Rhine, but the Ruhr before you get there. The Danube, it sees a whole raft of major river crossings. The same with the Elbe and the Mulde, which is the river that's halfway there. To meet the Russians, we've got to cross the Flippin River. So this is all about engineering and bridging. But we bring landing craft. We bring quite a lot of large landing craft down the network of sort of canals to get to the Rhine, so that all the major Rhine crossings have got small flotillas of Higgins boats and LCMs and all the rest of it that enable this to happen. This is the hour of the buffalo, or as the Americans call them, the alligators, used in huge numbers. Not for D-Day. There's a whole debate to be had about that. And I've had many a happy hour with Steve Zaloga, wondering why LVTs aren't used for the Normandy landings. But they most certainly are. They really see their birth and use at Valkyrien. And the Rhine crossings would have been far more difficult without them. I mean, one thing that always intrigued me, going back to Band of Brothers, you see the 101st in DUKWs going through the Bavarian Alps. Well, and I always thought, well, clearly the set designers were short of vehicles, and they threw in a few ducks because you're not going to have DUKWs down there. And the answer is they were there. What are DUKWs going to do once you've crossed all the rivers? They're redundant. Are you short of 6x6 trucks? Yes, you are. A DUKW is actually a 6x6 truck, and you can fill a lot of people in it. And actually, they're a much more preferable ride because the tires were bigger and you had a far more comfortable journey than you did in the back of a GMC. So they were used because they supplemented all the truck companies that were used and abused all the way through the war. So that's why you get this curious picture of riding to Berchtesgaden in DUKWs, because they simply get absorbed into the this huge war machine through pressure of necessity. So I'd throw in amphibious operations, which as an extension of bridging, are surprisingly common. But you've got this going on all the time. Then you get the Poles arriving at Wilhelmshaven. And they capture 3 cruisers, 200 Kriegsmarine smaller vessels, and a flotilla of 18 U-boats. Same with the British in Hamburg and Kiel. So I mean, you are stretching people's understanding and imagination just of the sort of combat forces there. And in terms of having to write about all of this, I mean, I had a lovely letter I had to pick apart of a soldier who ends up, I think, in Bremen, a young officer, and his father is a wine merchant. So he writes back in terms of all the wines and vintages he has seized along the way that he uncovers in Bremen. So the eyes through which you look at various operations vary enormously, and the language used can be quite bizarre. I mean, you know, describing your advance through Germany in terms of wine vintages is a bizarre step. And you know, it meant something to this guy, and it meant a lot to his father because he was the wine merchant. But it's not something you'd reach for. But I found it, you know, rather amusing and rather touching because they are, you know, it's an element of normality in this crazy world.
And when does your book finish? What do you conclude with? Does it take us up to VE Day, or do you talk about, as John Harris asked there, do you talk about post-war administration, displacement camps? I mean, you just mentioned Wilhelmshaven there. Isn't that where the Allies got the majority of the intelligence they used in the war crimes? Or am I thinking of, was that Wilhelmshaven where they got that?
No. Yeah, I mean, huge numbers of records do end up there. And with the Germans in Flensburg, which is where Dönitz sets up his you know, post World War II or post Hitler 3 weeks of Nazi government, which brings me on to, okay, so where do we finish? When does the Second World War end? It ends on the 8th of May 1945, but there are plenty of people who carry on fighting. There are U-boats in the middle of the Atlantic that end up in South America. There are Georgians who rise up against the Germans on Texel Island off Holland and carry on fighting until whatever it is, the 18th of May. There's a weather station in Spitsbergen that only surrenders on the 4th of September, which is 4 months after Montgomery's surrender to Montgomery. So those dates are flexible. But when's the Third Reich end? Well, the German army isn't abolished until whatever it is, September 1945. The eagles have to be removed from, or not eagles, but swastikas have to be removed from public buildings not till September 1946. German field police, the Feldgendarmerie, are kept in uniform with their small arms, and they are policing German prisoners of war, so they're used by the Allies to look after their own. They're kept in uniform until the summer of 1946 with all their Nazi regalia. So, you know, you sort of suck your thumb and see which to try and work out technically when the Third Reich comes to an end, because there are all these sort of different. The Nazi Party isn't abolished on the 8th of May 1945. Neither is the Wehrmacht. They take time to be abolished. There's all sorts of different sort of machinations. So I talk a bit about all of that and the surrender, the different surrenders in detail. And I end up with a picture of what life is like in the various occupied zones in 1946, 1947. And that's through the eyes largely of soldiers who've fought their way there. They've been home on leave, but essentially they're still part of the occupation force. Because 21st Army Group instantly becomes the British Army of the Rhine. It's exactly the same organisation. The different corps become occupation sectors centred around different German cities. Why does Germany end up being put back on its feet? Really interesting topic to sort of venture into, and that's probably one for you in the future. But, you know, this is because if we carry on being harsh to the Germans in the various occupation zones, immediately after Eisenhower is governor of his zone in Germany, Montgomery of his, if we carry on being nasty to the Germans and pushing them down, we'll drive them into the arms of the communists. And we realized that by 1946. So the idea is not just to tidy up Germany, but from 1946 to start putting them back on their feet.
Well, and it's the morphing between World War II and what we eventually labeled the Cold War. Again, it's not a neat one war ends, then there's a gap, then another one starts. That the Cold War had effectively started, almost people thinking about it in 1943, 44, I suppose. If you want to go back early enough, that everyone knew there was going to be a post-war situation. But that probably is a discussion for another day. But to bring things to an end about the Battle of the Bulge, you know, we talk a lot about historiography and where we are now. And, you know, you do your podcast with me and you talk to James and Al and you're writing your books. we've probably done a lot of. There are probably more books on Normandy and D-Day than there are books on the Ardennes, I would venture. Do you think there's still room for more to be learned about the Ardennes offensive? And if so, what areas should we be looking at in the future? Or should the next generation of historians be looking at when we're looking about the Battle of the Bulge?
Well, fortunately, there are more university courses in sort of Second World War studies and the Holocaust than there ever were. I wish when I'd gone to university, there was a wide range. Almost no one offered war studies as an option, and that means we're generating huge amounts of scholars. So the historiography has shifted in recent years to the suffering of the civilians.
Yeah.
You noticed Anthony Beevor starting to do this. And you and I are aware that there's far more writing now about the suffering of the Normandy civilians.
Yep.
And the same in the Bulge. And the key historian there is Peter Schrijvers, who's produced 2 very good books about the suffering of the civilian population in the fighting throughout the Ardennes. And I mean, that's quite interesting because, it involves, locals helping the Americans, but also suffering at the hands of the Germans. So it integrates quite a lot of different aspects of the battle. There's certainly more to be done there because, people would interview the soldiers, but not the civilians. And now we understand that they are just as much as a part of the story, just as important. Without them, the soldiers would have a much, much tougher time. And of course, some of those civilians are members of the resistance anyway, so they have a different story to tell. I mean, even in the Ardennes, we are using local civilian intelligence to build up our picture, and not just Belgian and French, but eventually German as well. So there's all of that. There's still signal stuff that's being declassified that we will learn more from. I mean, in years to come, and not now, because it's still classified, all the records of the distant relatives of our royal family who were German are still under wraps.
Yeah.
We know a lot about Edward VIII, but Prince Philip's sort of distant cousins and all the rest of it, who are part of the German army, part of the German political setup. That will all appear one day, and that will sort of add colour to our understanding, not necessarily of the Bulge, but of the war. But in a wider sense, there's a lot more to come. If we look at the way Market Garden has recently been written about, far more emphasis now has been put on the civilian side of the story. There's lots more of that to come out of the Bulge. I think we exclude the air picture far more than we should do. I tried to incorporate it in my book. But air tends to be written separately. And what we need is a good book that integrates the American story or the Allied story in the air and tying it into the land campaign far more than has been done. And there are some very good Bulge-specific historians. So I'd think of Danny Parker for one.
Yeah,
great work. Quite a few different books on the aspect. So I think we, in sum, we've probably got as far as we're going to get with Kampfgruppe Peiper.
Yeah.
But again, going back to the archives, you need to realize, just how unpleasant and ruthless a killer he was. He's not a glamorous poster boy, and can be, presented as such even by Mike Reynolds. And he and I, when he was alive, had, long debates about him. So we need to keep all these people in perspective. I met one of his troop commanders, as you'll read in the book, Hans Hennecker, who was absolutely charming. And we would have dinner together. We'd discuss opera. We'd walk the ground. It was only after he died I learned that he had been charged and sentenced to death for war crimes, not at Malmedy, but elsewhere. But he never told me. And actually, the sentences were commuted. But he never told me while he was alive. And I had not a sneaking bit of suspicion, which just shows you how, as a historian, you've got to be on your guard all the time. And that means there's always more to uncover. So we don't need to know any more about the fuel capacity of a King Tiger, or the wear and tear of the tracks of a Panther. We don't need a book that maps every single tank and armored vehicle in the Bulge. We've gone that far, but there are still plenty of gaps. Engineers in the Bulge, I think, was written by David Perrin, who seemed to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, great book. I got to know David quite well. He was a really nice guy. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Yeah, he came to Normandy a few times. That wonderful book as well. Yeah.
It's a great book, but what we need is a modern account called Engineers of the Bulge that talks about all of them doing exactly that, because so much of it revolves around bridges, and Allied as well as German. So both sides of that. So I mean, there's all of that. The organisation Todt, who end up providing a lot of the construction or engineer. I mean, civilians working for the military in the Bulge because the Germans run out of their own field engineers.
Yeah.
So there's a story to be told there. Never mind. I don't know much about Bodenplatte from the point of view of German pilots. So there's a lot to be brought in. So yeah, in sum, there's a lot more. I spent some of my career in media operations in the military. So how the Bulge was reported at the time, never mind analysed afterwards, by both sides. There's a book to be written there that certainly hasn't been written yet.
Yeah, that would be one for Philip Woods, who did the book on the reporting of the war in Burma. He could turn his attention to the Ardennes, because that would be another insight. And my point would be as well, and we've talked about it before when I had John Buckley on a few weeks ago. The young people John is teaching, the other advantage they have is they have this information that we didn't have 30 years ago, the digital archives and things like that. But also they don't come with this baggage of you and I and James Hall and Al growing up, having seen Patton and The Longest Day and The Guns of Navarone, because we have these our childhood ideas of what we think Montgomery's like and Patton's like and Eisenhower's like. And John Buckley, and I think others have said this, your 22-year-old person starting war studies now probably hasn't seen Patton. They haven't seen The Longest Day. They haven't even seen Saving Private Ryan. That's 20 years old. So they're looking at these figures from a fresh perspective on what it actually says in the documentation, without this idea they have of George C. Scott or whoever it would be for whichever film. So I think that's a key area that the next generation will bring in. They won't have that bias. I'm not going to change. I wouldn't swap my childhood with anybody. I loved watching those films every Saturday afternoon, but I know that
not Battle
information. Sorry, not Battle of the Bulge. No. But yeah, that information has affected our first reaction to reading these. Even though we're looking at archives and you're trying to be neutral, you're trying to be. We talked about on Twitter a couple of days ago. When you read a Patton quote, you read it in George C. Scott's voice in your head, not General Patton's voice.
Not General Patton's high, squeaky voice. Exactly right. No, so, well, I mean, it's a good moment to just pay tribute to John Buckley, because I went to university very late after sort of careers doing other things. And I went to the University of Wolverhampton, which had just started up that year, offering a war studies degree, or the year before. And I must have been one of John's first students. So he taught me, how to be an academic and how to ask questions. So I owe John a lot, and I'm very pleased that his course is still continuing, and it's attracting the numbers it has, because you ask around the military history fraternity in staff colleges and military academies around the world, the English-speaking world, and Wolverhampton has generated, so much positive thinking and some great scholarship, both, Second World War and First World War with Gary Sheffield. So, John, if you're watching, or any of John's students, I'm tipping my metaphorical chapeau to you, because I'm very grateful to what you taught me. And I would twin that with, my other great mentor, which is Richard Holmes. And I'm not sure these figures were around much, for earlier generations. So we've been extraordinarily lucky, you and I, with access to public figures. And that's why, on Twitter and elsewhere, I try and interact with people, because I know that, I got a lot of the head start I did by these great military history authors and presenters on television interacting with me and giving me the time of day. And therefore, I feel, I owe it to other people to have that same kind of relationship. The way we're chattering away here too. I mean, you and I, have created a great friendship. but it's been more virtual and online. We've hardly
It
ever
has,
met
yeah.
face to face.
We'll have to meet up again in person. But yeah, you're right, and I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of historians who've turned me down for this show, and I'm up to 400 shows in a few days' time. It's amazing how many people have come on, and there's no money involved, and yet they just want to share their knowledge. They want to go out there and reach a different audience, because as we've talked about before, books reach a certain audience. Events like Chalk Valley, Warfest, Chelsea Literary Festival, they reach another audience,
exactly.
and YouTube and podcasts reach another audience. Okay, there's overlap between all those audiences, but they're all important and they're all interesting. But anyway, we will bring things to end, I think. So when will the book be out? When will the Fire and Steel be out?
Okay, so we're looking at May for the English edition, which will be called Victory in the West, and for the American edition, which is called Fire and Steel, it'll be the following month, just for distribution reasons, in June. So that's if I've finished getting the maps done.
The maps. Oh, yeah.
And the selection of photographs. But lots of my Twitter friends have been really helpful with just having a look at things, offering ideas or photographs. So I'm very grateful to you all. What I might do, because I know several people have asked, is Mr. Bohr, as you know.
Mr. Bohr's going to come in. Yeah, people have been
Mr.
asking
Bohr
how
has gone for a walkabout, and I know one or two asked for a cameo appearance just to prove that he exists and he's come back safely. So I'll just see if I can get him.
Okay. Here comes Mr. Bohr. There he is.
There we are, a bit sleepy, but back, happy to be back and helping me with my military history. So there we are, a pour from Mr. Bohr to you all. Woody, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Happy New Year. So, folks, I will see you all again on Saturday with Jonathan Ware to bring off finish off the Ardennes. We'll look at the 53rd Welsh Division, but that's it. I'm taking a 2-week break. Back again with the Rise of the Third Reich with some amazing guests coming up in the month. Keep in touch. Follow us on social media. If you're not following Peter Caddick Adams on social media, you should be. If you haven't bought Snow and Steel, what are you waiting for? The links are in the description below. And folks, thank you very much for watching. So this is Paul Woodadge and Peter Caddick Adams for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your evening. I will see you on Saturday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Woody, thank you.
Bye.